Hello and welcome to another video. Now this video is going to be a follow-up to the previous video I did on flash bulbs. In my previous video I covered the what and the why about flash bulbs. For this video I'm going to be covering the how to use flash bulbs. So word of warning, this one is probably going to be more instructional, and if that's not something that's interesting to you, you probably will be bored with this video. So just to let you know, I'm going to focus mostly on how to use flash bulbs and walk through the whole process as part of this video. Now I should also mention I am by no means an expert in the use of flash bulbs. Flash bulbs were in use before my time, really. By the time I started getting serious about photography, flash bulbs were definitely on the wane, and certainly by the time I got my first SLR, flash bulbs were sort of a thing of the past, even at that time. But using flash bulbs is something that I find really fun, and the results that I've gotten with flash bulbs I really enjoy. So my knowledge on flash bulbs primarily comes from having read many books, particularly those that were published back when flash bulbs were sort of in their prime, back in the 1950s and 1960s. I do have some resource books that were published before then. I think the earliest book I have was published in 1940, so right around the time when flash bulbs were really starting to hit the mainstream. And then I've got a ton of manuals from old cameras and especially old flash units that talk about the use of the flash. So that's my main resource. I also rely on my father, who is from the era of flash bulb use. So he's given me a lot of great tips over the years on how to use flash bulbs, things that you wouldn't necessarily find in a manual, but really can only find out from talking to people who used them back when they were new. So I'll share a few of those tips and tricks with you here in this video, and hopefully you'll find some use out of those. Now I'm not going to go over the history of flash bulbs. Again, there's just too much to cover in one video. Flash bulbs first came on the scene in the early 1930s, and they were in use pretty much through the 1940s, 1950s, 1960s, mostly through the 1970s. By the end of the 1970s, and certainly by the early 1980s, flash bulbs, the use of flash bulbs just fell off a cliff and were supplanted by electronic flash very quickly. So those prime years, the 50s, 60s, and early 70s, you'll see a lot of cameras that can use flash bulbs and were set up for flash bulb use, even cameras that also can take electronic flash. Now during that period of time from the 1930s through the 1970s, there were just a wide range of different flash bulbs that were made, so there's no way I can cover everything in one video. So I'm going to be focusing on three specific sizes, which are the most common that you might run across. The first is the number 5. Now, this just happens to be a box of 5B, which is number 5 blue. These are blue coated bulbs. These are very common and very powerful. I'll also be covering the number 6, or in this case, the number 26 flash. 6 and 26 are essentially the same flash, just depends on which manufacturer manufactured the bulbs. And then the size that I'm going to cover are the AG1s, which you've seen me use in the previous video I did about flash bulbs. Now you can see AG1s, which were introduced right around 1960, I think maybe 1959, 1960. These are very small. This is a package of 12, and half of this package is just the label. The main box is right here. Compare that to the box of 12 number 26 bulbs, and you can see this was a great advancement in terms of making bulbs smaller. Now, there was another size that was pretty common through the 50s and 60s and a little bit into the 70s, and that's the M series. So, for instance, these M2s, M3, M5. These were pretty common as well. I'm not going to cover these just because I got to limit what I talk about in some way, and that would just get to be too much. But using those bulbs is very similar. They just have a different socket size. Now we come to the most difficult topic of all, and that is the topic of flash synchronization. And really the only way we can understand how to synchronize flash bulbs is to first talk about how flash bulbs themselves work. So here's a diagram of a typical flash bulb, and stepping through the various components of the flash bulb, component number one is really two components, two lead-in wires that come in out of the base of the bulb, similar to a regular light bulb. And then connecting the ends of those two lead-in wires is a filament, number two, again, similar to a standard light bulb. Now, the two ends of the two lead-in wires are coated in a primer paste, which is called out as number 3 here. It's not really shown as a part of the image, but if you imagine the two tips of those lead-in wires being covered with a primer paste, when electricity is applied to the two lead-ins, the filament immediately gets incredibly hot, just like a light bulb, and actually ignites that primer paste. The primer paste, in turn, then ignites the actual material of the flash bulb, the flash material, shown here as number 4 on the diagram. Number 5 indicates the presence of an oxygen-rich interior on these bulbs, which was used to further enhance the flash characteristics of the bulb. Now, all of this happens in a split second, but that split second is still a measurable amount of time, and this is where the synchronization and timing of flash bulbs is quite different from the use of electronic flash. So here's a graph comparing the relative duration of electronic flash versus flash bulb. The portion of the graph that's labeled A is the electronic flash, and the portion of the flash that's labeled B represents the flash bulb duration. This is obviously not to scale, but it really illustrates how the timing of these two different types of flash are very different. The beginning of the graph represents when the flash is first triggered, and you can see electronic flash is essentially an instantaneous flash. It's not really. It does have a very short duration, but for the purposes of comparison to flash bulbs, electronic flash is essentially instantaneous. Very different from flash bulbs. A flash bulb has a period of time after the electricity has been applied before it will even start lighting, and then there's a very distinct bell curve or approximation of a bell curve for the light output, and that's all over a measurable amount of time. Now, don't let this graph scare you. You're not going to need to know this level of detail in order to use flash bulbs, but it does help to understand what the flash bulb is doing and why the synchronization timing is so important to get the most out of your use of flash bulbs. So if we look at the left side of the graph here, this shows the general bell curve I was just talking about. And if you think about the far left side of the graph being the trigger point, the time at which the current is first applied to the flash bulb, and moving to the right as time passes by, there is a short period of time where nothing is happening at all, and then the light output from the flash takes a steep climb up to a certain peak, after which it peters back out down to 0, and there is a measurable amount of time that it takes for that all to happen. Now, to make this all even more complicated, there are a number of different classifications of flash synchronization timings. The 4 most common classes are shown here: Class F, which stands for fast; Class M, which stands for medium; Class FP, which I'll get back to in a second; and then Class S, which stands for slow. Now, for this video, I'm going to be concentrating on the Class M, medium, and I'll also talk a little bit about Class FP. These are the 2 most common classes of flash bulbs that you'll use. The Class FP is a special type of bulb, which the FP originally stood for flat peak. And if you look at the curve characteristic here on the graph, you can see that the peak is actually quite extended and maintains a pretty consistent output for a period of time. Now, the purpose for these flash bulbs, the FP flash bulbs, was to allow the use of a flash bulb with focal plane shutters. And we'll get to the reason why focal plane shutters use a different type of flash bulb here later in the video. But it is worth noting that FP, which originally stood for flat peak, because it's dedicated for use with focal plane shutters, because focal plane has the same initials as flat peak, over time the term FP morphed from meaning flat peak into meaning focal plane. And certainly by the 60s and 70s, most class FP flashbulbs were labeled as focal plane flashbulbs. Now you might be wondering, how do I know what class my flashbulbs are? It's usually marked right on the package, as you can see here, and also the class is consistent for each type of flashbulb. So for instance, these Westinghouse SMs are a class F, and other SMs made by other manufacturers are also class F. Now for this video I'm going to be concentrating mainly on class Ms. They're by far the most common type of flashbulb, and certainly the ones that are easiest to use. Here is a box of Sylvania Press 25s. Press 25 is one of the class M types. Number 5 is also a class M type and is probably the most common one that you'll come across. So let's talk about the timing of a class M flashbulb. This characteristic performance curve shown on the screen here shows what every class M flashbulb will output. So the peak output occurs at 20 milliseconds after the initial firing, and the initial half peak occurs at about 15 milliseconds. Now the timing of the shutter is timed to coincide with the highest point of the peak, which is typically from the initial half peak to the final half peak, represented here as X1 and X2. So this means obviously the opening of the shutter has to be delayed until a period of time after the initiation of the firing of the flashbulb. Now, if you just open the shutter at the same time that you trigger the flashbulb, you can see what happens. This is for a shutter of 1/100th of a second, which opens at the same time that the flashbulb is triggered. The dashed line represents the time that the shutter is open. The solid line represents the time that the flash will actually be producing light, and you can see that the flashbulb will be producing light long after the shutter has closed. So one way to address that problem is just to leave the shutter open longer, of course. So in this second diagram here, this shows a shutter speed of 1/25th of a second, which will open at the same time that the flash is triggered. The flash will light some period of time after that, and then the flash will burn out before the shutter is closed. So the film will capture the entire duration of the flash. But most of the time that isn't really very ideal. We don't want to use shutter speeds of 1/25th of a second or slower to use flash bulbs. We want to be able to use flash bulbs with any shutter speed. And so the way that is achieved is by delaying the opening of the shutter past when the flash bulb is first triggered. And this is typically a delay of 15 milliseconds for class M flash bulbs. So when you set your flashbulb capable camera to M synchronization, this is in effect what you're doing. You're delaying the opening of the shutter by 15 milliseconds so that the shutter, whilst open, will capture the peak of the flash output. Okay, so let's dig into it. Now, the first thing to think about when using flash bulbs is the type of flash unit that you're going to use. And one of the most common types is the proprietary flash units that came with many cameras, particularly back in the 40s and 50s. So for instance, the very popular Argus C3 has its own proprietary flash unit that has its own plug in the side here. Doesn't fit into any other camera, but is proprietary to this camera. You might see other cameras like the Kodak Duoflex series. Again, the flash unit is proprietary to this camera. It doesn't fit anything else. Or similarly, this Kodak 620 Flash Brownie has a very unusual flash unit that clearly doesn't fit onto anything else. So that's one style of flash unit that's proprietary to the camera that you're using. Okay, so let's put this into practice and actually fire off some flash bulbs. So I'm going to demonstrate with my Kodak Duoflex that I was just showing. And like I said, this camera has a dedicated flash unit that's specific to this camera. So the first thing we need to do is take a look at the chart on the flash unit itself. And in this case, I'm going to be using the number 5 bulb, which you can see here is on the right side of this chart. And for the lens on this camera, which is the Kodak lens, we're looking just at the red numbers. And so it's pretty basic. You just look at what type of film you have. Now these are film types that are from the 50s, but we know that, for instance, Verichrome from that time is about ASA 100 and PlusX is about ASA 125. So if I'm shooting with a 100 speed film, I just come over here and I can see that the range is between 5 and 16 feet. This is a great way to get started with flash bulbs because it is so simple and there's not really much to go wrong. You just put the bulb in and fire away. Like I said, I'm going to be using a number 5 bulb, so I've got the bulb here. And I've already got batteries in the flash unit. So the way this works is there's a base on the bulb, obviously. On the base of the bulb there are 2 little nubs that need to slide into the appropriate slides in the flash unit. That's all there is to it. And then as I fire off the camera, boom, there goes the flash. Now, the very first thing to know about using flash bulbs is they get hot. So after you've fired the flash, do not touch that flash bulb. It can burn you. Let it cool off for a few seconds. A lot of these cameras have ejectors on the back of the flash unit so that you can safely eject the bulb without touching it. But to be totally safe, just let it sit there for 30 seconds to a minute and it will eventually cool off. Okay, so if you are shooting with one of these simple cameras and you are using a film speed that's not listed on the chart, there's a very simple way to figure out the correct distance for your film speed and flash bulb combination, and that is with this formula here. Now, don't let the formula get too confusing. It's actually pretty simple. You simply take the film speed that you have, divide it by your reference film speed, which is usually going to be ASA 100, take the square root of that and multiply that by the reference distances. Now, the 2 adjusted distances that you calculate, the near distance and the far distance for the range, those are going to remain the same throughout the entire roll of film, so you can typically jot those down on a piece of tape and put that on your flash unit, or you can just remember the range. It's usually pretty easy. So the cameras that had flash units that were specific for those cameras were built up through the 1960s and maybe even into the 1970s a little bit with some of the lower end cameras. But starting in the 1950s, as flash started becoming more commonly used, more universal type flash units were starting to be used. And a very common one in the 1950s in particular was the Kodak flash holder, like this one. And as you can see, it's not made for a specific camera. It comes with a bracket, and that bracket allows you to attach the flash to a camera via the camera's tripod socket. And then there's several different mounting points on the bracket, so it can be adapted to different sizes of cameras. And then the key here is that the trigger is by a cord. The flash socket at this time was typically on the camera shutter, and this would plug directly into that, and then this could be adapted to a number of different cameras. And then moving into the 1960s, or even in the 1950s really, but sort of the late 1950s, you started to see these other types of universal flash. This is a Honeywell Tiltamite, which I used in my first video on flash cubes. Obviously you can see it's much smaller, and that is that the flash is mounted to the camera via the camera's cold shoe. And then again, there is a cable with a PC socket that plugs into the camera, either on the body of the camera in the case of a focal plane shutter, or on the shutter body itself in the case of a leaf shutter. And these were really extremely popular units. Like I've said before, you'll find many of these out there still today. They're very inexpensive, $10 to $20 for a really nice one. And the reason they're so compact is that they use a expanding fan type of reflector. And so the reflector can actually be folded up, and which makes the equipment obviously much smaller than the type that doesn't fold. Now, a similar type of flash unit to the Honeywell Tiltamite is this Argus. Again, it's got a expanding fan type reflector. The difference with this one, though, is there's no cord. It actually uses a hot shoe. So there were a few Argus models that had hot shoe flash, even for flash bulbs, that this worked with. And if you had a hot shoe available, even with later cameras, you could use this flash. So really the first step to figuring out how to shoot flash bulbs with your specific camera is to figure out what type of flash unit you're going to need. So the next thing to think about with your flash unit is how the flash is going to be powered. So flash units prior to 1950 and even up through the 1960s in less expensive cameras relied on batteries alone. So for instance, this Kodak flash holder, although this is from the 50s, it can be fired with just batteries, 2 C cells. Many of the flash units that were for specific cameras, especially on lower cost cameras, were fired by batteries alone. Now the problem with that is flash bulbs require a very high current in a very short pulse to fire the flash bulb. And the use of batteries alone does work, but batteries, the way that they're designed and the chemistry of the battery don't work really well for providing that short burst of high current, especially over and over. And so what happens is if you have a flash unit that just uses batteries, you'll find that the batteries will become exhausted pretty quickly. So in around 1950, there was a major technological advancement in the manufacture of capacitors. So capacitors went from being like the size of a shoebox or even bigger down to being very small in a matter of just like a year or two. As a result, flash units were able to take advantage of that new technology and include capacitors in the flashbulb firing system. Now, the advantage of a capacitor system is that the capacitor drains the battery with a very low current, charges the capacitor, and then the capacitor can provide that very high current burst that's required to fire a flashbulb. So these flash units were known as BC flash units, and if you read any flash documentation from the 1950s in particular, during the period when this changeover was happening, you'll see a lot of references to BC flash. BC standing for battery condenser or battery capacitor. Capacitor, condenser, two different words that mean the same thing. And the advantage to the battery capacitor flash is that it's much more reliable. It will more reliably fire your flash bulbs, especially when you're going through a series of them. And on top of that, your battery will last much longer because the capacitor is draining the battery with a low current, which batteries are designed to do. And so they can provide that consistent current to charge the capacitor much longer than they can provide the short burst of a very high current that's required to fire the flash bulbs directly. So interestingly, when you look at a flash like the Kodak flash holder, which was designed for 2 C cells, Kodak also actually produced what's known as a BC flash pack, which would convert the Kodak flash holder to a BC flash unit. So this flash pack is the same size as 2 C cells, but it includes a capacitor and then converts your flash into a much more reliable BC unit. By the 1960s, most flash units were BC flash units. So for instance, the Honeywell Tiltamite that I've talked about quite a bit is a BC flash unit. And if I open up the back here, you can see there's the capacitor and then a slot for the battery right next to it. I don't have the battery in it right now. But it just makes the flash unit so much more reliable. Now, if you're just getting into flashbulb photography and you've already got a camera that's got a flashbulb unit on it, but it's a battery-only flash unit, I would say go ahead and use that. You're just going to have to replace batteries a little bit more often, but since you've already got the unit, you might as well use that. If you're in the market for something to try out flash bulbs, again, I would highly recommend the Honeywell Tiltamite. There's so many of these out there. It's a very reliable flash unit, and on top of that, it allows you to use 3 different types of flash bulbs, which I've talked about in my previous video. Okay, going back to the timing, let's dig into a little bit more detail about how Class M flash bulbs work with relationship to the shutter, and I want to get into this detail in preparation to tell you about Class FP flash bulbs, which are a little bit more complex. So looking at the graph here of the light output versus time, of course, if we think about the 0 point at the left side of the graph being the point at which the flash is first triggered, there's no light output at all for the first few milliseconds. And then as the light output begins to build, at about 15 milliseconds, the shutter will open, which is right about the half peak of the light output peak. The shutter will remain fully open throughout the whole peak, and then on the downside of the peak, the shutter will close. And so by the time the flash is done, the shutter is completely closed. One thing to notice here is that the diagram is specifically looking at a leaf shutter and the way a leaf shutter works. And so if you think about it, when a leaf shutter opens, the entire frame of film is all exposed at exactly the same amount. And so if you think about the time between when the shutter first opens and when the shutter closes, the amount of light that the film is receiving at any given time is continuously varying throughout that whole period. But it doesn't make any difference to the exposure because the entire frame is being exposed at the same time, even during the opening and closing sequence of the leaf shutter. Now, this Class M characteristic light output peak works just fine for a leaf shutter, but when we start thinking about how this might work with a focal plane shutter, things get a lot more complicated. If you know how a focal plane shutter works, the higher shutter speeds are achieved by using a small slit in the shutter that moves across the frame of the film. So that movement of the slit in the shutter across the frame takes some time. And as you can see, if I overlay here the way that slit would interact with the Class M bulb, each portion of the frame is going to be exposed at a different light output as that slit moves across the frame. So the way we address that with focal plane shutters is to use the Class FP flash bulb. And these are flash bulbs that are designed to have a flat peak, like I mentioned before. And that flat peak of light output lasts for a duration long enough for the focal plane shutter to complete its passage across the frame. So every portion of the frame of film is exposed at more or less the same light level. Now, one of the big advantages, which you're probably already recognizing, is that means that Class FP flash bulbs can be synchronized with focal plane shutters at any shutter speed. This is an advantage even over electronic flash, which are typically limited to a maximum shutter speed at which the entire shutter is open at a single instant. Okay, the last technical topic that I'd like to touch on, and then we'll get into shooting some actual flash bulbs, is the topic of guide numbers. Now, guide numbers are well known among anyone who uses flash even today. Guide numbers were originally developed for flash bulb use, and it's just been carried over into electronic flash use. So if you look at the back of any package of flash bulbs, the package will give you an indication of the guide number to use for the flash. And especially starting in the 60s and 70s, those tables became very extensive, so it was actually quite easy to figure out the correct guide number for your film speed, and then even you could figure out what shutter speed you might want to use, aperture you might want to use, and distance you might want to use, and any combination of the three was right there on the table. Now, the primary guide numbers for each film speed are in this column right here, and on earlier packages of flash bulbs, this might be the only column that you're given. Probably won't see all of these other columns for f-stops and distances. And in fact, you might not even be given that many choices of film speeds, and possibly not even any film speeds at all. There just may be some film types listed. But as long as you can figure out the ASA for at least one of the film types that's listed on your package, you can always calculate the different guide numbers for different film speeds based on that one guide number that's given on the package. So how do you calculate the adjusted guide number if you don't have the film speed listed on your package? Well, you use this formula here, which probably looks familiar. It's essentially the same formula that we used to calculate the adjusted distances that were given on the chart on the simple camera. And that should make sense since the guide number and the distance are linearly related, of course, by aperture. So we'll just walk through this one more time. It's pretty straightforward. You'll have a reference film speed, which is ASA sub r, and you'll have a reference guide number, which is GN sub R. And what you'll do is input your adjusted film speed, which is the film speed you're calculating for, divide that by the reference film speed, take the square root of that, and then multiply that by your reference guide number, and that will give you your adjusted guide number. Now, it looks and sounds a lot more complicated than it really is. Once you've done this once or twice, you'll find it's just a very simple calculation. Okay, so what do we do with these guide numbers? Well, the guide number, which is even used today, is simply a number that defines the power of the flash, and it is a product of the distance times the f-stop. So this typically is used to calculate the f-stop by first determining the distance to your subject and then dividing that under guide number. So for example, if you have a flash with a guide number of 200 and your subject is 12 feet away, the resulting f-stop is going to be somewhere around f16.7 or just rounding up to about f16. Okay, well, if you're still with me, first of all, I am incredibly impressed because this has been a long video and I've presented a lot of information. So if you're still with me, first of all, I'm impressed with your stamina. Second of all, I'm going to reward you by firing off a few flash bulbs here to finish off the video and give a few examples of different cameras using flash bulbs. So the first camera I'm going to show is my Petri 2.8. I did a video on this camera before, which you may have seen. And this is a leaf shutter camera. And the first thing you'll see that I have to do is on the side of the lens here, there is a switch for switching between X-Sync and M-Sync. So the first thing I need to do, right now it's set to X-Sync, I just need to switch that over to M-Sync, like that. Now it's got a synchronization set up for flash bulbs, and specifically class M, like this number 5. So this is a number 5B, and the way that this works is I'm using the Honeywell Tiltamite. I'm just going to push that straight down in. It will snap into place like that. Alright, now with the shutter wound, we'll go ahead and fire. Now, one of the interesting things to talk about with the Honeywell Tiltamite, which I didn't mention before, is right on the flash unit is a guide number calculator. So you don't even have to do any calculations. You just set your guide number according to the top dial here, and then it will provide you with all of the different combinations of distances and f-stops. So a very simple way to figure out what f-stop to use when you're using the Honeywell Tiltamite. Okay, so the next camera that I'm going to shoot with here is this Ward's SLR600 from the mid-1960s. This is a focal plane shutter camera, and so obviously I'll be using an FP class bulb. This is a number 26 bulb. Now for a lot of focal plane shutter cameras, you'll notice on the side here, this is pretty common for the time, there are actually two different plugs for the flash type that you're using. Rather than having a switch like on the previous camera, this camera has two different plugs, one for FP synchronization and one for X synchronization. So I just plugged the exact same Honeywell Tiltamite into the FP plug, and now it's synchronized for FP bulbs. And we'll go ahead and push the bulb in. Once it's locked into place, we'll see if we can tell any difference with this focal plane. And there's a little smoke rising even here. These things get really hot, so be very careful when shooting these, and in particular, try not to get too close to your subject. Now the last camera I'm going to demonstrate is this Kodak Tourist 2. This is a model that I did a video on as well. Now this is the 1/800th of a second Anastar top of the line camera. And one thing to note here, let's see if I can get close enough that you can see this. You can see this is a leaf shutter camera, and so it's going to use M class, but you can see for this high-end shutter, sometimes you'll see shutters that actually have adjustable settings for the synchronization timing. So you can see there's a setting for M, there's a setting even for F, which is unusual because usually you fire F-class bulbs with the X synchronization. So this allows you a little bit more refined control, and you can actually set that lever to any of those settings to really refine the control of your synchronization. This would be something that you would do as part of a professional outfit. So on this one, you can see the plug plugs right into the side of the shutter body as a leaf shutter camera. So we'll go ahead and cock the shutter with the little cocking device. And there you have it. Okay, well, I think we're going to call it quits at this point for this video. What am I in here? Like 36 minutes. This is a really long video. A lot of very dry information. So if you've made it this far, congratulations, you've made it to the end. And if there's more information I can come up with for flash bulbs, I will produce a part 3. But for now, this will constitute part 2. And thanks again for watching.